Medieval dungeons were not simply places to confine bodies. They were places designed to break spirits. At the heart of this design was darkness, a weapon as effective as chains or torture devices. Buried beneath castles, fortresses, or city walls, dungeons were often deliberately constructed underground, where the absence of light was as punishing as the cold stone. For those cast into their depths, time ceased to exist, and with it, the fragile boundaries of sanity. Darkness in these chambers was not an accident. It was an instrument of fear. The architecture of dungeons reflected this cruel purpose. Small, narrow openings were sometimes carved into walls, but many cells had no windows at all. Thick stone blocks shut out daylight, leaving prisoners dependent on the faint glow of a torch carried by a guard or the dim flicker of a candle, if they were allowed one. Most were not. The result was total blackness, an environment where day and night blurred together. A prisoner might sit for weeks or months without seeing the sun, their sense of time collapsing into an endless prison of shadow. This darkness carried physical consequences. Without light, the body weakened, eyes strained against the gloom, leading to blindness or permanent damage. Damp air and stagnant conditions bred illness. Without the rhythms of day and night, the body's internal clock faltered. Prisoners lost track of sleep, falling into cycles of exhaustion, hallucination, and despair. Darkness ate away not only at the body, but at the very structure of life, leaving captives reduced to shadows of themselves. Yet the true cruelty of darkness was psychological. Humans are creatures of light, oriented by the rising and setting of the sun. To strip that away was to strip away the foundations of reality. In the absence of sight, the imagination grew monstrous. Every sound, the drip of water, the scurrying of rats, the groans of fellow prisoners, was magnified, distorted by fear. Silence, too, became unbearable, pressing down on the captive like a weight. In the blackness, the mind turned inward, conjuring horrors more terrifying than any guard could invent. Darkness became a mirror in which prisoners saw only their isolation and despair. Guards and jailers understood this. Darkness was cheap, efficient, and devastatingly effective. It required no elaborate machinery, no skilled torturer, only a sealed door and a refusal of light. Some prisoners were left alone in cells so dark they could not see their own hands. Others were chained in communal dungeons where the only glimpses of light came when a door creaked open, briefly illuminating rows of hollow faces before plunging them back into shadow. In both cases, darkness served its purpose. It broke willpower, destroyed hope, and ensured compliance. Stories from the medieval period describe prisoners driven mad by darkness. Some clawed at the walls until their nails bled, desperate to feel something other than stone. Others spoke to themselves, or to rats, or to voices only they could hear. Darkness disassembled the mind piece by piece, until even confession, true or false, seemed a relief, to be released into light. Even if only to face torture or execution, was in some ways a mercy compared to the endless blackness of the dungeon. The symbolic power of darkness made dungeons feared far beyond their walls. For ordinary people, the threat of being cast into the dark was enough to silence dissent. To vanish into those depths was to cease to exist, erased from the rhythms of life above. The dungeon's darkness was not confined to its cells. It radiated outward, a shadow cast over entire communities, reminding them that defying authority meant disappearance into eternal night. Even today, when the remains of medieval dungeons are shown to visitors, their oppressive darkness is what lingers. Guides describe how captives lived without light, their cells airless and silent, their eyes straining in vain. Standing in those spaces, one can feel how darkness itself became an accomplice to cruelty. The dungeon was more than a cage. It was an experiment in deprivation, where the absence of light turned into a weapon sharper than any blade. The medieval dungeon teaches us that cruelty does not always roar. It sometimes whispers. It takes the form of silence, of blindness, of endless night. Darkness was not simply the setting of imprisonment. It was the punishment itself. In using it, rulers learned how to break prisoners without lifting a hand. And in doing so, they revealed the terrifying truth that sometimes the greatest torment is not pain, but the absence of light. If medieval dungeons were designed to strip away dignity, nowhere was this clearer than in the cramped and diseased cells where prisoners were confined. These were not neutral spaces for holding the accused. They were deliberate tools of punishment, places where airless rooms, filth, and disease combined to make survival as cruel as execution. In these cells, suffering was not only inflicted by guards or torturers, but by the very environment itself, as stone, damp, and rot worked together to turn confinement into a slow, suffocating death. The size of these cells reflected their cruelty. Many were barely large enough for a man to lie down, forcing prisoners to curl their bodies against cold stone. Others were crowded, with a dozen or more captives crammed into spaces meant for half that number. Chains anchored them to walls, restricting movement to a few painful steps. The lack of space meant constant contact. Prisoners pressed shoulder to shoulder, unable to escape the stench of each other's sweat, blood, or decay. Claustrophobia was unavoidable, and despair was amplified by the sheer physical impossibility of comfort. The air in these dungeons was foul. Ventilation was almost non-existent, with only a small grate or hole, if any, to connect the prisoner to the outside world. Smoke from torches, the stench of waste, and the damp of underground chambers combined into a choking atmosphere. Disease thrived in this environment. Plague, typhus, and dysentery spread rapidly, carried by lice and fleas that infested clothing and straw bedding. Corpses often remained in cells for hours or even days before removal, contaminating what little space the living had left. To be thrown into a dungeon was often a death sentence, not by executioner's hand, but by infection and neglect. Food and water were scarce, and what little was provided was often spoiled. Bread was hard and moldy, water stagnant, and crawling with filth. Malnutrition weakened prisoners, leaving their bodies vulnerable to disease. Some captives resorted to gnawing on bones or scraps scavenged from the floor, desperate to keep themselves alive. Starvation and thirst became as much a part of the punishment as chains or whips. Survival was possible, but at the cost of health, sanity, and dignity. The cruelty of these cells was heightened by their filth, waste accumulated in corners or shallow pits, rarely cleaned and often overflowing. Rats and vermin fed on scraps and corpses, their squeals echoing through the night. Prisoners slept among vermin, their bodies bitten, their wounds festering. When most people imagine medieval dungeons, they think of chains and darkness. But in truth, these spaces were not only for holding prisoners, they were laboratories of cruelty, places where torture was not an exception but a routine. Behind the cold stone walls, rulers and inquisitors used dungeons to break bodies and extract confessions, wielding instruments designed not to kill quickly but to prolong agony. The dungeon was not simply a prison. It was an arm of authority, where pain became policy and suffering was methodically applied in the name of justice. The rack was one of the most feared devices employed in these chambers. A prisoner was bound by wrists and ankles to rollers at either end of a wooden frame. With each turn of the handle, the body was stretched beyond its natural limits. Muscles tore, joints popped, and tendons snapped as the victim screamed in torment. The rack was not usually meant to kill. it was meant to extract confessions or implicate others. In many cases, the physical destruction was permanent, leaving prisoners crippled for life even if they survived. But the rack was only one of many instruments of torture that turned dungeons into factories of fear. The scavenger's daughter, a device that crushed the body into a crouched position until blood flowed from nose and ears, stood as a cruel counterpart. Iron collars and manacles suspended victims from walls or ceilings for hours or days, their own body weight pulling at dislocated joints. Whips, hot irons, and boots designed to crush bones were employed with ruthless regularity. The dungeon was filled not only with the cries of the tortured, but with the mechanical creak of devices engineered for pain. Water torture was another common method. Prisoners were strapped down while water was poured steadily into their mouths, choking them, filling their lungs with the sensation of drowning. In other cases, victims were forced to endure icy water in pits or buckets, their bodies shivering as cold seeped into their bones. The simplest elements, water, heat, iron, were twisted into instruments of torment, proving that cruelty required no great invention, only imagination and malice. The use of torture was justified by authorities as a tool for truth. Confessions gained under torment were treated as evidence, even when false. Under unbearable pain, victims would say anything to make it stop, naming themselves guilty or implicating friends, neighbors, or family. Torture spread suspicion like wildfire, feeding cycles of accusation and imprisonment. The dungeon became a courtroom where the verdict was written not in ink but in screams. Routine torture was also psychological. Prisoners awaiting interrogation lived with the dread of hearing others scream in the next cell, or the sound of a rack being prepared. Guards sometimes paraded instruments before captives, describing their effects in detail, letting fear do its work before iron ever touched flesh. The dungeon's cruelty lay as much in anticipation as in action, breaking wills before bones. What made this routine all the more disturbing was its bureaucratic order. Torture was often regulated by law or decree, with rules about how long a device could be used or how many turns of the rack were permitted. This veneer of control gave the practice legitimacy, as though systematic agony could be sanitized by procedure. In reality, these limits were rarely observed, and even when they were, they inflicted more than enough suffering to destroy lives. Torture was not a lapse in justice. It was embedded in the very structure of it. The stories that emerged from these dungeons reinforced their reputation as places of unrelenting horror. Prisoners left broken, bodies mangled and spirits shattered, carried the memory outward. Chroniclers recorded the cruelty, and whispers spread through towns of the punishments lurking in castle depths. The threat of the dungeon was enough to silence dissent, for everyone knew what awaited within, not simply imprisonment, but agony by design. Today, when people look upon the remnants of medieval torture devices in museums, they often see relics of barbarity. Yet in their own time, these instruments were routine, normalized within the machinery of justice and control. The dungeon was not a place of rare exceptions. It was a place where cruelty was method, where routine meant suffering. To be sent, there was not only to lose freedom, but to become subject to a system in which pain was standard practice. The medieval dungeon teaches us that torture was not an aberration, but an institution. Its stones bore witness to a routine of agony, where instruments of horror were used with cold efficiency. Behind every iron clasp and wooden frame lay the truth that in the dungeon, torment was not only expected, it was guaranteed. When people think of medieval dungeons, the focus often falls on chains, darkness, and physical torture. Yet the most enduring torment was not always inflicted by iron or flame. It was psychological. The dungeon was as much a machine of the mind as of the body. Its silence, isolation, and hopelessness worked steadily to dismantle prisoners long before the executioner's blade or the torturer's rack touched them. Mental anguish became a weapon as sharp as any blade, turning imprisonment into an ordeal that crushed the spirit as completely as it destroyed the flesh. Isolation was one of the dungeon's cruelest tools. Prisoners were often left alone for weeks or months in tiny airless cells deprived of human contact. The absence of voices, of familiar faces, of any sign of compassion hollowed out the mind. Humans are creatures of community, and without it many prisoners unraveled. Some spoke to themselves until their voices cracked. Others clung to hallucinations, imagining companions in the darkness. Isolation stripped away the prisoner's sense of self, leaving only fear and despair to echo against the stone walls. Hunger and thirst deepened this torment. Food, when it arrived, was meager, often moldy or crawling with vermin. Water was foul, stagnant, and barely drinkable. The physical weakness of starvation merged with the mental torment of knowing that survival was deliberate cruelty, stretched out day by day. Prisoners were given just enough to linger, but never enough to feel alive. Each bite reminded them that they were being kept in a state of slow destruction. The dungeon also inflicted suffering through sound, or its absence. Some chambers were silent, but for the drip of water or the shuffle of rats. The monotony of such sounds became unbearable, gnawing at sanity. In other cells, silence was broken by the screams of the tortured. A prisoner awaiting interrogation might hear cries from the chamber next door, each shriek a promise of what was coming. The imagination, inflamed by fear, often inflicted more torment than reality. The dungeon used anticipation as a weapon, stretching terror across endless days and nights. Uncertainty compounded the suffering. Prisoners rarely knew their fates. They did not know when or if they would face trial, torture, or execution. This uncertainty became its own form of torment. Some clung to hope that release might come, only to have it dashed with each passing day. Others surrendered to despair, praying for death as a release. The lack of knowledge, the absence of control, made every moment an agony of waiting. Psychological torment was also engineered through humiliation. Prisoners, once nobles, soldiers, or respected members of their communities, were reduced to filth and chains. Their clothes rotted on their bodies, their dignity stripped by vermin and waste. Some were paraded before guards or fellow prisoners to heighten their shame. The message was clear. In the dungeon, no rank or status mattered. All were reduced to despairing captives, stripped of identity and pride. Some dungeons perfected psychological torture through deliberate design. Cells were constructed with low ceilings to force captives to stoop, or with irregular shapes that disoriented the senses. In places like the Tower of London, little ease held prisoners in a space so small they could not stand, sit, or lie flat, leaving them twisted in pain. Such designs inflicted constant discomfort, a daily erosion of body and mind. This was not accidental architecture. It was cruelty built into stone. The effects of this psychological torment were devastating. Many prisoners broke before torture was applied, confessing under the weight of despair alone. Others emerged from confinement alive but shattered, unable to rejoin society. Chroniclers tell of men who once held power reduced to incoherent shadows of themselves, their spirits broken by solitude and fear. The dungeon destroyed not only bodies but reputations, leaving survivors marked by shame and madness. The legacy of these psychological methods is haunting. They reveal how cruelty need not be violent to be effective. The dungeon showed that silence could scream louder than pain, that darkness could wound deeper than swords, and that despair could be deadlier than execution. By turning confinement into torment, Rulers ensured obedience not only from prisoners, but from all who feared sharing their fate. Today, when visitors peer into medieval dungeons, it is easy to imagine the chains and racks, the instruments of physical pain. Harder to grasp is the psychological weight, the crushing silence, the endless waiting, the mind collapsing under hopelessness. Yet this was the true power of the dungeon, not just to wound the body, but to unravel the soul. Medieval dungeons were never just places of confinement. They were symbols, dark reminders of who held power and what awaited those who dared to challenge it. Built beneath castles and fortresses, they embodied authority in its harshest form. Their purpose was not only to punish prisoners, but to intimidate entire communities, transforming stone walls and iron chains into instruments of psychological warfare. The dungeon was as much about those who saw it from the outside as those who suffered within. Castles dominated medieval landscapes, looming over towns and villages as visible expressions of feudal control. Beneath their grandeur, hidden in their foundations, lay the dungeons. These underground chambers were reminders that the Lord's justice was absolute, that disobedience or rebellion could end in darkness. To peasants who glimpsed prisoners dragged into fortress gates, the message was unmistakable. Resistance meant vanishing below, where screams would echo unheard. The dungeon's reputation, whispered and feared, was often enough to ensure obedience without the lash of a whip. For rulers, dungeons were political tools. Holding a rival in chains beneath one's castle was not just imprisonment, it was domination. Nobles, who once sat at the king's table, could be thrown into cells, their fall from privilege made public. The dungeon stripped them of rank, reducing them to the same misery as common criminals. This humiliation sent a clear message to others of equal standing. The crown's authority could reach anyone. In this way, dungeons were not only about punishing individuals, but about displaying power. The symbolism extended to public life. Tales of what happened in dungeons spread quickly, often exaggerated but always terrifying. Rumors of torture devices, starvation, and madness created an aura of dread far larger than reality. Authorities relied on these stories to maintain control. The dungeon became a specter that haunted imaginations, its darkness seeping into the daily lives of those who feared being cast there. The mere threat of the dungeon silenced dissent more effectively than armies, for fear is the strongest chain. Executions linked to dungeons amplified their symbolism. Prisoners were often dragged from their underground cells to scaffolds in full public view. Their gaunt bodies and broken spirits testified to the horrors endured in confinement. The crowd watching saw not only the execution but the unspoken warning. This is what happens to traitors, rebels, and enemies of the crown. The dungeon and the scaffold worked together, one hidden in darkness, the other blazing in daylight, to enforce obedience through fear. Even architecture reinforced this symbolism. The heavy iron doors, the echoing corridors, the barred openings that admitted no light, all were designed not only to contain but to intimidate. Visitors to castles, even those who never saw the cells themselves, knew what lay below. The fortress above might dazzle with banners and feasts, but the dungeon below whispered of chains and despair. It reminded all who entered that power rested not only on splendor but on fear. Over time, dungeons became embedded in cultural memory as symbols of tyranny. Chroniclers described their horrors, poets evoked their darkness, and survivors testified to their misery. The word dungeon itself became shorthand for cruelty and oppression. Even centuries later, when many medieval prisons had fallen into ruin, their reputation endured. The dungeon was remembered less as a practical space and more as a symbol of what unchecked authority could inflict. Today, the ruins of these dungeons still carry that weight. Visitors descend into narrow, airless chambers, their footsteps echoing against cold stone. Even without prisoners, the atmosphere remains oppressive. The symbolism is clear. These were not places of order or fairness, but of fear. They remind us that medieval rulers understood power not only in terms of armies and wealth, but in the ability to instill dread. The legacy of medieval dungeons as symbols of fear and authority remains powerful because it speaks to a universal truth. People obey not only because they are forced to, but because they are afraid of what happens if they resist. In the Middle Ages, that fear took the form of underground chambers where light never reached, where cries went unanswered, and where hope was extinguished by stone walls. The dungeon's true power was not only in breaking prisoners, but in warning everyone else. In the end, medieval dungeons were monuments to control. They were not simply prisons, but symbols, built to show that power could reach into every life, and that those who defied it would vanish into darkness. Their legacy is not only architectural, but psychological, reminding us how fear can be institutionalized, and how authority is often built not on trust, but on terror.